This is Doug Cook, and I live on what was Pawtucket land, currently known as South Hamilton, Massachusetts, in the Ipswich River watershed. And tonight, along with me, is Carol Roselle, our Education Director and Grant Administrator and Soil Carbon Coordinator. Welcome to Designing Abundant Gardens with Christie Higginbottom, Ruth Green, and Allison Houghton. First, I'd like to thank all of the NOFA Mass staff and board who have helped to make this workshop possible. Also, we want to thank our sponsors. Chelsea Green Publishing, an employee-owned company, brings in-depth practical content about organic gardening and more to life with books, ebooks, and audiobooks. Go to chelseagreen.com and enter the code PWEB35 at checkout to receive a special NOFA Mass Resilient Garden discount on your next print book purchase. Chelsea Green Publishing is cultivating change from the ground up. As well, Ward's Nursery. At Ward's Nursery, they pride themselves on being a leader in offering horticultural products you can count on. Knowledgeable staff you can trust, and friendly customer service. Ward's Nursery and Gardeners located in Barrington, Massachusetts. And most importantly, we want to thank you, the viewers and listeners, especially our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. Please consider becoming a member and making a donation to support our important work. And we like to use this map here before we begin to take a moment for you to locate yourself on this interactive map. There is a link in the chat. If you haven't already, please consider learning more, not only about the history of the indigenous people who once resided in the areas where you're coming from, but also learn about their present day political structures, issues, and goals. We also suggest that you learn more about the ongoing history of Black exclusion from property and farmland ownership. Please consider making solidarity work with local Black and Indigenous groups as a part of your environmental and land-based work. We owe so much of what we know about how to grow food and manage land in a way that is regenerative and ecologically responsible, not only to the people who were here before colonization, but the people who were brought to the United States as slaves. And rather than erase them, we should honor and support and seek justice for their descendants who have survived centuries of oppression and white supremacy. And we'll drop some links into the chat for organizations you can learn more from. So with that, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge and express my gratitude to everyone here for sharing this space together. I encourage you to focus on your breath in this moment and feel the connection with your body and the place that you're in. And with that, I am very happy to introduce our first presenter tonight, Allison Houghton, who is a statewide educator and author on organic gardening topics. Her past work includes serving as the NOFA Mass Education Director, as well as the Assistant Grower and High Tunnel Supervisor for the Food Project in Lincoln, Mass, and as the Director of Horticulture at Green City Growers. She's also the author of the free NOFA Mass publication, The Carbon Sequestering Garden, and The Urban Bounty, How to Grow Fresh Food Anywhere. She currently runs a micro nursery for edible and native plants at her home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And with that, Allison, it's up for you.
Yeah, unmuting. Okay, and there we go. All right, it's lovely to see you all and to be here. So I'm talking a little bit about siting. Actually, let me make sure I put here we go. There we go. Siting a garden and what is possible in a small space. And I'm just going to go through a lot of different options. I know you all are coming from very different places, so hopefully we'll get into some options or question and answers later on if you have any additional things, but I'll just go through a couple of different basic pieces. So I guess the first one just to talk about is when you're looking at a garden, really one of the biggest things you can do for your space and kind of success in growing is kind of seeing what light you have. So that it seems like a very basic one, but if you are in your garden, wherever you're going to put your garden and facing south, if you hold out your hands to either side of you, you can, if the at the very height of summer, east to west is directly overhead, and as at the very, very height of summer, which and sorry, let me just move all the people here on the side. There we go. 1 second. Okay, now I can see my screens. But May, June, July, you get this arc over the sky. And so at different times a year, in the spring and the fall, you start getting an arc that's much more, it's much closer to the horizon. And so this understanding that can really help you in navigating your garden space. And one thing, so I'm just going to give you a very specific example. So this is an example from my garden in our backyard. This is kind of a fascinating tool called Sun Seeker, which you can actually use to evaluate the number of hours of sunlight. And the reason this is important is we have basically from about April to October is the growing season in this region. It may be a little bit different from you depending on where you're coming from today, but being able to estimate the hours of sunlight is really, really important. So 4 to 6 hours is approximately, I would consider that low light. Anything above 6 hours is full sun for a backyard space. And the thing that's really interesting about urban spaces, or also rural spaces, if you're in kind of an area that has a lot of trees or other areas, is that leaf cover comes out at end of April, beginning of May, last week of April, first week of May. And so the thing that's fascinating is you can actually, if you know your profile, you'll notice these are 3 different pictures that kind of go across the same landscape. They're not totally lining up. The December one does, but just because it's a spherical thing, and this is a phone snapshot. But you'll notice that on the far right one, there are a lot of trees that don't have leaves yet. So if you have deciduous trees, you might actually get a full another spectrum of sun. And the reason it's helpful sunshine does give you a lot of extra window to grow things. At whatever you want. But if you do have low light, you can make decisions that, or lower light situations, you can make decisions that will give you success later on. So for example, cherry tomatoes might be a better option for you if you have a lower light situation than say the full heirloom tomato that takes a lot of time to ripen. And so you can make decisions, you could maybe grow more greens, but anytime you have a lower light situation, think of your leaves as solar panels. And so the amount of sun that they're able to collect will determine how long they take to mature. So radishes, in theory, can take as little as 24 days to mature, but that is if you're getting the full amount of sun. And so anything in a lower light situation will take a little bit longer. There's also, I will mention, there are a lot of perennials that can store up a lot of energy in their roots and then put out kind of growth first thing. Asparagus is one perennial vegetable that where a lot of us were familiar with, but there's a lot of other options. And then there's also some options for forest gardening if you're interested in that. And so low light does not have to be a limit, but you need to tailor whatever you have to your success. And so kind of you want to make sure that you are able to succeed and plan out your garden in a way that you'll succeed. Another basic one that I find is really, really helpful and also a great way to garden safely is really thinking about where you want to take a soil test, or making sure that you do take a soil test, especially if you're growing in an urban area that might have lead contamination or other issues in the soil. So for example, a lot of houses in the area I'm at have been painted with lead, or there used to be lead in gasoline. So along highways or roadways, you can sometimes get that. Also old orchards, they used to use lead arsenate. And so those are a number of areas that can oftentimes have lead contamination. So this is just an example of a place, just a theoretical house. This is actually very similar to a house that I worked with one woman. But there is the street view, driveway on the side, house in the middle. And if you notice, north is in the bottom right corner. You can kind of, that arrow to show you where north is. But if you think about that, and if you were to stand anywhere you're trying to site the garden, east is coming up, and kind of just imagine the sun going directly overhead at the height of summer. And these shade trees kind of provide a little bit of challenge for where you're going to place the garden. So this person was looking at putting in the best place for sun is in the back, kind of where the light is. But one of the challenges she found is she actually took a soil test right near the end of the house. And I would say that generally when you're looking at lead in the soil, there's usually a few feet within the structure is sort of, there's like almost like a halo where you might see higher levels. So she found medium lead levels in her soil. This person, that's sort of example. So we had one lead test that was right up against the house, kind of one in the middle here. The shed was new, so there was no structure before then. So that was incorporated as sort of a representative sample. And I will say that you can take lead or soil tests are very easy to take. You can UMass Amherst is a great place to get it if it wasn't open last year during COVID. So University of Maine also is a great one for an affordable soil test. They cost usually about $20-$25, and they're a great way to identify if you're doing an in-ground garden. You can decide to do raised bed or containers if you're worried about it. And then also I will say, if you are, so for this woman, she ended up finding she had medium lead levels on the low end of medium. And so she was able to, she ended up planting fruiting crops in this area that were tall, that didn't lay against the ground. Fruit does not tend to accumulate lead, especially if you work with the soil organic matter. Cover the soil, you're kind of minimizing any kind of dust. And she actually found out she was fine in the rest of the this area. But even along the fence, if it's it might be a newer fence, but if there was an older fence there, it's good to check there. So just being mindful of kind of where you're siting your garden, but also the options, and don't think of I guess lead as a limit to what you can't do, but it is something that is a health concern that you want to make sure you're able to address. So organic matter in the soil can help buffer lead. Plants don't want to uptake it, but they will if they don't have a good nutrient base in the soil. And so, making sure that you have good organic matter, mulch on the soil surface, all those different pieces, and really like addressing any nutrient deficiencies that you have is a great way to kind of manage lead. And if you do have high levels, really just be cautious with it because it can be quite a challenge. And I actually, one other thing I will mention about that is also the front of the house. And let's see if I can go back. Yeah, the front of the house, it's lower light, but you can still grow things, even fruiting crops, like currants, gooseberry, all sorts of different fun fruiting crops can grow really, really well in lower light areas. So again, it's you can be constrained, or you can kind of think of them as opportunities. So this is these are two examples of raised bed gardens, and so this is me in the left, and I'm actually thinning out the garden. So this is kind of growing really densely. The one to the right, this garden was actually a low light garden. So we mostly picked greens and then tried to grow as intensely as possible. So if anyone's new here to gardening, the square foot gardening method is a great way to really maximize your space. You're basically dividing your garden into quadrants, and it may sound silly, but it's a great way to really pack it with plants, but give each plant enough space. And then you can thin out your plants as a salad, or food in between as they're kind of growing bigger. So that is an excellent method for doing that. Also, even if you're growing an in-ground garden, having borders or boundaries that allow you to grow really actively within a certain space can be very, very helpful for how you do it. And also thinking about low light, it might allow you to grow, if there's benefits there too, you can grow things like lettuces that might be a little more sensitive to heat, maybe all year round. So there are thinking about all these different options when you're choosing whether to do what style of garden to do. So these are examples of raised bed gardens. This is sort of a crazy picture of my balcony early on in my growing, but this is a dwarf-sized peach tree, and so there's a lot of fun options that you can choose even in very, very small places. I will say that when I decided to do this, we did check the weight bearing on this porch. So you do definitely want to, make sure it had I-beams or whatever it is, just so be careful about weight. But a lot of places are graded for snow weight. And so just make sure you have it. The picture to the right here, these are self-watering containers. There's a homemade, you can buy them, but I will say that if you are able, this has been a strategy that I've used when I've had to grow out of containers, and I really recommend it. Normal containers, when you water them, they might get moisture, on the top, but it might, the moisture either might get too wet in the bottom or dry out, and you get kind of this weird stress for plant roots. So self-watering containers, the way they work is they have a water reservoir on the bottom. You use, there's little pipes. You can water into the pipes, or some nozzle of some kind. Some people use things like bamboo. You can use a lot of really creative solutions, but you water that reservoir down below, and there's a foot that's kind of held up, and it wicks water up into the soil body. And so it mimics an in-ground system that is very, very resilient to drought. So if you're thinking about this soil body that is able to hold a lot more water moisture. So I've seen plants grow twice the size in these containers compared to the exact same plant planted at the exact same time in a non-watering container. So if you're looking for a way to succeed with gardening containers, this is a great option, even in a very small space. And you can do them yourself, or you can, I think they have options now where you can buy them as well. All right, so these are, if you're also, again, growing in small spaces, herbs or other things are really helpful for, getting the most for your very small space. So this is a great option. But what I will say here is all these herbs each have a different growing style and preferences. And so when you're growing your plants, get to know them and their personalities, if you will. So for example, dill and cilantro up at the top corner, they like cool weather. They are great to grow from seed. They're very quick compared to some of the others. And so you can grow them, you can almost cut and come again. They just keep they keep doing things, but eventually when it gets too hot, they will flower, and that's kind of, they're done. So just, you can do multiple successions of them. Basil is also an annual. So there's annuals and perennials. Perennials, they come back each year. Annuals, you have to plant every year. But basil is an annual that'll last for most of the season. As long as you pinch off the flowers on the top, it'll keep producing. But really thinking about these different herbs as best you can in these different spaces. So also, woody herbs that take a little bit longer, just getting to know the personalities. Parsley is a biennial, so it means it'll last an entire season without flowering, but if it goes through any kind of winter, or even a pretend winter, like in a greenhouse, if you're starting it from seed, if it gets too cold, it'll flower. So that's a great thing if you're trying to get parsley seed, but for most people, that pretty much means that the plant is finished. So knowing when to replant things, how to keep them alive, and which ones come back again and again is really helpful. And also knowing the style. So again, like rosemary and lavender here, they're very woody, and they grow very slowly. So when you prune them or harvest them, you do it a little more gently, whereas something like mint is very aggressive. You can prune it aggressively and it loves that. So it responds really, really well. So anyway, those are just thinking about the personalities of plants. These are herbs here, and they're excellent for anybody who's starting a garden and it just has a small space. This is another, I think, brilliant idea that if you haven't heard of, or if you want to try it and you only have a windowsill and it's not even very well lit, it's just barely enough light. This is a really excellent resource. Peter Burke, and he's come to NOFA conferences in the past, but it's just a very quick and easy way to grow nutrient-dense salad greens very, very quickly, even with really minimal light, and to do it fast. And so it's just, I think he's got some really innovative stuff here. So it's a very helpful strategy for quickly growing. So I definitely recommend that as a resource if you're interested and you don't even have necessarily full light. It could be a north facing window, still works. It's a great option. This is kind of an interesting piece. These are mushrooms growing under my coffee table. And they are essentially, I went to a coffee shop that gave extra grounds, and inoculated those grounds with grain spawn, which is just pieces of wheat or some kind of grain inoculated with mushrooms. You can get them at any mushroom supplier. And the thing that's really interesting about this is you can actually grow mushrooms. They need just a tiny bit of light. They don't need a lot of light. So you can grow a very nutrient dense food. These are both oyster mushrooms. The one on the right are actually blue oysters, which are quite fun. They come in all different colors. But the leftover grounds afterwards are also a really excellent soil fertilizer. So you can actually add these to a garden. And the thing that I found fascinating about this is, so the mushrooms will break down or kind of break down this material, and you can do this. You don't have to do this with coffee grounds. You can do it with straw or any different thing. But essentially, all you want to do is you want to sterilize. Coffee grounds are great because you put hot water through them anyway. But you want to somehow soak straw or whatever material, toilet paper rolls, old books, in water for a certain amount of time, hot water, and then let it cool, and then you mix it in with your a pre-prepared grain spawn. The one on the right is actually a kit, so if you want to start out like that, you can. But this amendment in the soil, it has enzymes in it that actually break down organic pollutants. So things like oil or DDT or lots of different things. So after the mushrooms are completely done and you've harvested it, you can spread this in your garden or compost pile, and it can do incredible things for your soil. So this is just a fun one that is a little bit different, but you can definitely do it, and you can do it in your house. Just don't let them spore or go past. So just to be extra, not getting mushrooms in your space. And then this is just an example of an in-ground garden. And I mentioned before that the growing season is about April-ish, like mid-April to maybe October. That is only 7 months. And so if you can expand just a little bit, even a month on either side, you've suddenly expanded your window to 9 months. Or maybe if you're able to eke out 2 months on either side, it could be 11 months that you're able to grow. And so different things can work in different ways. So for example, this high tunnel here, there's actually goat manure under there, and it's essentially a hot compost buried under these tunnels. And so which is great because it's its own little heating source. It doesn't, I think it might give you a little bit of a head start or help with germination of seeds, but you can plant very specific things. So there's certain crops that are a little bit hardier, and you can get things like floating row covers, it's kind of like a thin permeable fabric that allows light and water to get through, but it just gives it a little bit of a cover. So you can grow things in the fall to expand your growing into the winter. That's one strategy. Or you can start things early on and let them kind of, as soon as it warms up in the spring, get going. And so there's two kind of different strategies, but for a small growing space, and especially if you remember those pictures of the light going across the sky and what you have, if you have deciduous trees all around you that usually block your light, you might have this perfect window to get growing. So if you do have a situation like that where you actually have maybe 8 hours or 10 hours without those trees filling in with leaves, if you're able to get something started, or seeds planted in February or March, we get hit or miss weather depending on the weather patterns, but if you're ready for it, you can always reseed things. And so things like pea shoots, I love. A lot of Asian greens are excellent, and cold tunnels, same with arugula, clatonia, matcha or corn salad. There's a bunch of different type things. Spinach too. Spinach can be finicky, but it sometimes does. There's certain varieties that do really, really well, either in the fall or in the spring. So there's a lot of different options. And again, I will say that there's a lot of different plants that are adapted to this region, many that are weeds. So one weed that showed up in our high tunnel that was actually incredibly nutritious is, and for, again, small growing weed. So I would just throw chickweed into smoothies. It's a very soft tasting green. It doesn't have a strong flavor, but it's full of nutrients and is an excellent, excellent option for eating in the wintertime. So even some of the weeds can be really beneficial or medicinal.
Thanks, Allison. It's my pleasure to introduce Christie Higginbottom, who has coordinated the historic program at Old Sturbridge Village for over 30 years, researching, planning, planting kitchen gardens, flower gardens, and the museum's herb gardens collection. Now retired from full-time work at Old Sturbridge Village, she presents programs on historic gardens and heirloom plants, and she teaches home gardening classes. And at this time, Christie is going to jump in and talk a little bit more about the plants that we want to choose to get the most out of our space.
Yes, well, I'll dovetail with a lot of the things that Allison said here. I'm really glad that our talks come together so well. I'm going to talk about selecting crops and then planning the season. And the goal is going to be to try and get the most out of your season. And I'll echo one of the things that Allison was saying. Oops. Oh, that. I call it plant empathy. Learning, one of my favorite garden quotes is from Barbara Damrosch's Garden Primer, when she said, good gardening is very simple, really. You just have to learn to think like a plant. And so a lot of what I have learned is what I've called plant empathy, getting to know your plants, just as Allison was saying, and learning as much as you can about them, just as you would if you were getting to know new people and you were going to work with them. So in selecting crops, especially I'm thinking of people who may be just getting started with gardening, who might not have a lot of space yet, or perhaps your time is somewhat limited and you're trying to choose what you're going to grow this year in your garden. Here are just a few priorities that I would think about. You want to certainly give preference to the things that you and your family love to eat. That's going to be key. And experiment a little bit too. Every year I try and grow something I've never grown before, just as an experiment. It gives you a new sense of what gardening is all about. I think I would also give priority, if I had limited space and couldn't grow everything, I would give priority to plants that are best fresh from the garden. So we all know, for example, that you can't get the best tomato you ever ate from a supermarket. The ones that will hold up being shipped and be durable are not necessarily the best ones to eat. And I think this is one of the reasons why the tomato is such a classic garden plant. But there are several other things that fall into that category as well, I think. Greens, being able, as Allison was saying, to go out and harvest fresh greens for a sandwich or a salad. Things like snap peas that are best right off the plant, and even green beans that are just so wonderful when you bring them fresh out of your garden. I would give a priority to those. I'm going to be talking more in a few minutes about plants that will give a really good return for the invested space and the time that you have. So I'll focus on those in my talk to come. When you decide which crops you really want to grow and you're going to select varieties, I would recommend that you check your seed packet or the labels that you would find on plants that you might buy at a greenhouse. Look through disease and insect resistance. If you've got a small space, you don't want to be discouraged by a plant that you put in, which then succumbs to diseases and insects easily. Then once you've got them selected, what you need to do is figure out how much space each of these crops are going to need so that you can plan your garden. And it's good to keep in mind that some plants really like it hot. And I think traditionally, when we talk about gardens, so many of the times when you're looking at information about gardens or gardening, it will tend to focus on the last frost date in the spring and the first frost date in the fall. And so many people who haven't actually experimented with gardens tend to think that our garden season begins on Memorial Day and ends with the frost in the fall. And again, just as Allison was saying, our season is really longer than that. And what we want to do is keep in mind that there are a lot of plants that really love it to be cool. In fact, many of them hate the heat. And there are plants that can certainly withstand frost. And so if you're growing things like peas, lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbages, radishes, kale, a lot of the root vegetables, many things love the cool weather. They can go into the ground as soon as the ground can be worked. And that's a classic historic term. What it basically means is in the spring, we want to wait, of course, until the frost has gone out of the ground and until the ground has the excess moisture that the ground has accumulated over winter has gone out. We don't want our seed to rot before it germinates. And for many crops, it's also critical for the soil to have warmed up a little bit. But usually around here, it can vary from year to year a lot, but usually around here, when we get into the second or third week in April, we're starting to be into our garden season when those cool weather crops can start out in the ground. And so that gives you a much longer season of the year to think about what you might be growing. And a lot of the cool weather crops, if you wait too long to plant them, they won't succeed. Broccoli now is a classic example. Broccoli does not like to form the head, the part we really want to eat. It doesn't like to form that when the weather is hot. If you plant broccoli too late in the season, too late in the spring, and it starts to head up in late June and early July when the nighttime temperatures are getting hot, then it will bolt. Instead of forming a nice bunch of buds that you would love to eat, it will go to flower, and that can be really disappointing. So with the cool weather crops, getting them started early, you can start them indoors yourself, or you can buy started plants to get them, the ones that transplant well, going early so you can get them into the ground. Direct seeding, even peas, for example, a lot of people who have a piece of ground where the ground dries out quickly will try and get their peas into the ground by St. Patrick's Day. And so there are many things that you can plant early. Some like it hot, and many actually like it much better when it's cool. But to know this information and the important information you're going to need to plan your planting times and the space that you're going to need to grow things successfully, you're going to need some basic information. And I find that a wonderful place to get that information is from really good seed packages and also from good seed catalogs. There are several seed catalogs that even if you don't order your seed from some of these companies, if you order their catalog and keep it like a good garden advice book, it will give you in a nutshell the information that you'll want. So I highly recommend Johnny's from up in Maine. Also, High Mowing from Vermont is a great catalog. And out west in Oregon, Territorial Seeds catalog. All of these are valuable to me because of the level of good, precise information that they give you for planning and planting your crops. And so the kinds of things that you'll want to know, for example, on this High Mowing seed package, tells you that these tomatoes are tender annuals. They need to be transplanted. So you're not going to put the seed directly in the ground of tomatoes. You're going to start these seeds indoors or buy transplants and plant them outdoors after all danger of frost and night temperatures are above 45 degrees. I actually wait until my night temperatures are above 50 degrees for my tomatoes. And that's something I only learned probably about 10 years ago, the value of knowing night temperatures. And the reason night temperatures are so critical, excuse me, is because plants do their growing at night. During the day, when the plants have the available sunlight, they photosynthesize using water and minerals from the soil The plants have that magic power to turn chemicals from your soil into sugars and store those sugars and carbohydrates in the plant. And then at night, when there is no sunlight, they use those foods, those nutrients that they have stored, and do their growing. And temperature is very critical for that process. And again, this is where plant empathy comes in. Each plant has its own preferences for the temperatures it needs to do its growing. And so night temperatures, as people, we tend to focus on daytime temperatures. So when it's been really warm at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we think it's warm enough to plant something outside like a tomato. But you want to pay attention to those nighttime temperatures too. And this is where a catalog or a seed package can help you. With something like lettuce on the right side here, the advice is to sow it outside. You can start lettuce indoors and transplant it. It transplants really easily, but the seed is very tolerant of cold temperatures, and so you can actually directly sow it outside 2 to 4 weeks before the average last frost. The seed package also tells you that lettuce needs light for germination. You want to plant the seed very shallowly and just press the seed into the soil surface and cover it lightly. If lettuce seed is buried too deeply and no light reaches it, it won't germinate. So if you've ever sown lettuce and just had it not come up at all, that's probably the explanation for it. So all of these little details are really valuable, and where you can get it is from a good seed package or a good catalog. Now, the crops, some of the crops that I think, or the kinds of crops that I think are the most valuable when you're trying to make sure you get the most out of your time and your space, first of all, are the cut and come again crops. Again, Allison used that term and mentioned it. What we mean is a crop like a lettuce plant, a spinach plant, or a Swiss chard plant, where when you harvest, you can go out into the garden. Certainly you could cut a whole head of lettuce, bring it in the house and use it, remove the whole plant from your garden. But you have the option to just snip off some leaves, like pruning a shrub, and the plant will continue to grow and make more leaves. And so you can keep going out and harvesting more and more from the same plants. Some of these plants don't like it when it gets hot. And so what you need to do is you need to start them early and start your harvesting from them early. They may grow and mature early too. And so we're going to do what we call succession sowing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You can also look when you're buying seeds of things like lettuces and spinaches, look for varieties that are advertised as being heat tolerant. The cold lovers are fine for early in the season, but if you want to have some lettuce growing in your garden in July and early August, you'll want to look for varieties that can tolerate the heat so that you can plant the cold tolerant and the cold loving ones early in the season, and then shift gears and go to some of the heat tolerant ones later on. As an example on my slide here, I mentioned the plant called perpetual spinach or leaf beet, which will give you a spinach leaf, but it's unlike true spinach. It's a very heat tolerant plant. So you can grow this plant right through the heat of the summer and keep harvesting, cutting leaves from it. Swiss chard will also go right through the summer. It's happy in the cool weather. It's also happy in the heat. For my garden with myself and my husband to feed, about 4 plants of Swiss chard is all we need to take us through the season. So it won't take up too much space in your garden. It means that what you want to do when you plant these cut and come again crops, especially the ones that are likely to grow quickly and mature quickly, don't devote a huge bed in your garden to these, just a small space. Even a container is a great place to grow these cut and come again plants, because you're going to be sowing a bed of lettuce and then maybe 2 weeks later sowing another small bed of lettuce, so that when the first bed begins to go by and starts to go to seed, you've got a second batch coming along. If you plant a 6-foot bed of this and you're just growing it for your home family, you may find that a lot of your lettuce plants will bolt and go to seed before you get to use them, and you won't have used that space really well. And there are what I call continual harvest crops. These are crops where you plant the plant and the plant grows up and you wait for it to start to produce the crop you're going to harvest. In every case with these plants, these are actually all plants where the part that you're eating is the fruit. Fruit is a botanical term. The fruit of a plant is technically the structure that holds the seeds. So technically, a bean is a fruit, a cucumber is a fruit, a summer squash is a fruit. Keep in mind that when you plant these plants, what these plants are trying to do, their goal in the garden, is to produce seed, ripe seed. That's their contract with Mother Nature. And so when we plant these in our garden, they're going to keep producing as long as we keep harvesting them. So these can include things like bush beans, cucumbers, summer squashes, snap peas, tomatoes. Some of these more cold tolerant, like the snap peas, others heat lovers, like the beans, the cucumbers, and the summer squash. But these, once they start to produce, as long as you keep picking them, you will have crops for most of the season. The thing you have to keep in mind is that you have to keep regularly picking them. In the image here, you'll see some green cucumbers on the left, and then an overripe cucumber on the right. If you allow plants like beans and cucumbers and squashes to produce their seed-bearing fruits, the part you're going to eat, if you allow them to produce those, and if you allow them to make those mature, if you leave them on the plant, this can happen when you've got a cucumber vine that's just loaded with cucumbers, and you go out and pick them, and you just can't use all the cucumbers you've got out there, and the next thing you realize, you go out and you've got these big, fat, overripe cucumbers that you're not going to use because they're too ripe, or beans that have become too big and swollen to use as a green bean, and so you're not going to use those. What you may not realize is that if you leave those on the plant and don't harvest them early, then the plant is going to realize that it has actually produced ripe seed. It has fulfilled its contract with Mother Nature, and it's going to shut down. It's going to stop producing. The only way we can keep it producing is to harvest all of the fruits off of it, whether you're going to use them or not. I put a little folding table out by the edge of the road and put baskets full of green beans and extra cucumbers out there for the neighbors. So I know I don't want to leave them on the plant or the plant is going to stop producing. So this is a key to keeping those constantly producing plants producing for you and using the space in your garden well.
Christie, we have a couple
other plants that are a good
time. A couple more minutes.
Pardon me?
A couple more minutes for your presentation.
Oh, okay. High yield, long storage crops, things like carrots, beets, and onions. These are plants that, for the amount of space they take up, they will give you a huge amount of harvest. In a 6-foot row of carrots, for example, you're going to get 60 plus carrots. And so you get good use of space, and you can put your rows of these vegetables a foot to 18 inches apart. So we can get a really good use of the ground that we give up for them. They also are good long storage crops. You don't need special storage for them. A plastic bag in the hydrator drawer in your refrigerator, and you'll have them for months after you take them out of your garden. And so the key to some of this is understanding which crops grow quickly and are very cold tolerant. I list a few of those up at the top here. Which ones are cold tolerant, but they take longer, use more time in the garden. And then which crops are going to be full season crops? Which ones are going to be using the space in your garden from the time they go in the ground fairly early until the end of the season? And by understanding this, we can plan things like interplanting and succession sowing in the garden. To extend your season, what you want to do is look for varieties within your favorite vegetables that have different days to maturity. In other words, how long it takes from the time the seed or the transplant goes into the ground until you can expect to start harvesting. If you grow early maturing and late maturing varieties of carrots, then you can harvest the earlier ones and you'll still have later ones coming along behind them. We mix those. Also, stagger plantings to spread out the harvest of crops like summer squash and bush beans. It's a good idea to stagger plantings of summer squashes and zucchini, because once those plants, those hills of squash, begin to bear a lot of fruit, the stress of producing fruit can cause them to be more susceptible to diseases like powdery mildew. And so if you stagger the plantings, when your older plantings start to succumb to diseases, you'll still have younger ones coming along to produce. You can also plant some of these quick maturing crops among others. So you can interplant while the bean plants are small. You can stick lettuce plants between them. Lettuce can be harvested at any stage. So when the beans need the space, you can pick those lettuces and use them as a salad. Here is interplanting of tomatoes, leeks, and spinach, all close together. When the leeks and the tomatoes need the space, the spinach can be eaten and taken out of the way. With succession sowing, what we're doing is we're taking early crops, usually ones that are cold tolerant and which will be finished, will reach their days to maturity and be finished and harvested completely by midsummer. We'll follow those with a later planting of the same crop or of a different crop, usually something that will tolerate the cool weather in the fall. So an example of this is onions. So on the left here is a bed of onions. The small seedlings were transplanted into the ground on April 26th. They're very cold tolerant. They need the long season to form their bulbs. They're harvested on the right on July 28th. And then on July 28th, after the onions are pulled, we can plant fall greens, spinach, kale, and lettuces to give a crop into the fall. So planting all of these things allows you to establish your garden and make the very best use of your space.
Thank you so much, Christie. That was excellent. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Ruth Green. Ruth Green is owner and operator of Green Arts Gardens in Monterey, Massachusetts, and she has specialized in design, installation, and ongoing care of residential and historically appropriate native vegetable and ornamental gardens in the South Berkshire County since 2001. Ruth is a NOFA accredited organic land care professional and holds degrees in art, history, and landscape architecture. Her main concerns include soil restoration and stewardship, pollinator protection, and native plantings, and heirloom vegetable varieties. Welcome, Ruth. When you're ready, you can share your screen. I think there might be a little delay.
Yes, I think that's right. So I'll make sure that I only, advance it once.
Okay.
But you might be wondering why you want to attract insects to your garden at all. And part of what I want to show you tonight is that there are many insects of the good variety. There are many more of the good ones than there are of the bad ones that are going to damage your garden in some way. To begin with, insects provide essential pollinating services to agricultural and wild plants. Insects are responsible for pollinating roughly 1/3 of the agricultural crops in the US. In addition, pollination provides seeds and plants for countless birds and other animal foragers. Many adult pollinators also are predators in their larval stage, which means that they can keep damaging pests in check in our gardens without the use of harmful pesticides. Let's talk first about bees. Often people think of honeybees when we talk about pollinators, and indeed honeybees do pollinate many of the fruit and vegetable crops that are important to our diets. However, as you no doubt have heard by now, honeybees have been in decline for a number of years due to pesticides, habitat disturbance, and predators like mites. Now we often need to rely on native bees and other insect pollinators to produce many of our essential crops. Fortunately for us, native bees are everywhere, and we have more than 4,000 varieties in the US alone. Native bees are more versatile than honeybees and can forage early and late in the day and in more variable weather than their non-native counterparts. Our native bees are even described as keystone species, which means that they're essential members of a balanced and sustainable ecosystem. This balance can be seen in our own gardens as well if we take certain steps to invite our bee friends and attract them and support their lifestyle requirements. Our native bees include many solitary bees, and I'm mentioning this because a lot of people think that, that they want to avoid bees because they're going to get stung. But solitary bees like the carpenter and green sweat bees, as well as the leafcutter bees and orchard bees, do not sting. And each of them have particular plants that they pollinate as well as needs for habitat. They make up the majority of native bee species. We also have many bumblebees, some of which are solitary and some of which form colonies to rear their young. We're going to get into habitat requirements for these bees in a few minutes. There are many other pollinators as well that we'll want to encourage in our gardens, and I've shown some examples of them here. Hoverflies are often mistaken for bees, which is good for them because it protects them from being eaten by predators that don't relish eating bees. And they often pollinate some of the same crops that the bees would. Wasps are less likely to be pollinators because they lack the leg hairs that would make it easier to collect pollen. But this little pollen wasp, for example, is different because it needs the pollen and nectar to support its young. Butterflies also are less efficient pollinators than bees, but have evolved to support important plants in our ecosystem. And the same goes for hummingbird moths and for hummingbirds and the plants that they pollinate. Often bees are better thought of as scavengers and recyclers of garden debris, but they have their own group of plants that rely on them for pollination. And we'll talk about some of these creatures again when we get to look at how predators can keep our gardens healthy without the use of pesticides. So some of our pollinators are what we call generalists and are content to find nectar and pollen whenever they can. But others need the flowers of certain plant families to survive and create provisions for their developing offspring. This affects many of the foods that we want to grow. Here are some examples of vegetables and fruits that rely on specific insects to pollinate their flowers. This is not an exhaustive list, but it will give you an idea of the insects you would want to attract to your garden, depending upon what crops you want to grow. And of course, we all need seeds to plant, which means that many more insects are involved still to pollinate the necessary flowers. So how do we attract our pollinator friends to our gardens? We can start by choosing helpful combinations of flowering plants that the pollinators have learned to recognize as sources of food and habitat over many years of evolution. In other words, our native plants, the natives to our particular regions. This also means planting flowers that bloom very early and late in the growing season, as well as in high summer. Many pollinators emerge soon after the weather changes in spring, and they need nourishment right away. Here are some examples of early bloomers that, like the spring ephemerals, that bloom in deciduous forests before the canopy leaves out and reduces the available light. And they're called ephemerals because they grow, bloom, set seed, and disappear again by the time that the light that they need is gone because of the deciduous forests leafing out. Native columbine and foam flowers are also good choices, and they have abundant flowers and their adaptability, and they are adapted to sun and shade. Good choices for summer flowers include these wild geraniums on the left and mountain mint or pycnanthemum, as well as turtle heads, some milkweed varieties, and lobelia or cardinal flowers. There are many, many other kinds, but I included some of the examples here for you to think about. As I mentioned, fall flowers are just as important because many of our pollinators need to find nectar and garden to provide for their overwintering eggs for hatching in the spring, as well as to build up their own reserves if they remain dormant during the wintertime or the off season. Here are some examples of native fall flowering plants. And many of these are going to bloom until frost. Goldenrod which often we think of as a weed, actually has many varieties that look attractive in our garden beds and is a great choice for late season bloom. Some of these plants will double as overwintering shelters for insects and their eggs because they actually have hollow stems. So it's a good idea not to be too ready to cut down the garden in the fall and tidy everything up. If we leave these plants standing, we'll end up with a lot more pollinators in our gardens for next year. Let's keep in mind some of these flowering trees and shrubs when planting our pollinator gardens. Here we have the eastern redbud, the mountain laurel, and flowering shrubby dogwoods, and they add important sources of nectar and pollen for early foragers, as we were talking about nectar and pollen sources for the spring. The chokeberry and the bush honeysuckle follow with their flowers soon afterwards. We're going to touch briefly on insect-eating birds. I know that I designed this lecture as about insects, but I also want to talk about birds briefly in different places. For now, keep in mind that flowering trees and shrubs can also produce berries that will attract many species of birds. And the reason we want them is because some of them will stick around and eat our undesirable caterpillars while they're in the neighborhood. And in fact, they will even eat some of our bugs. I learned recently that hummingbirds are excellent at predators of spotted-winged Drosophila. And that's the tiny insect that will eat your soft fruits. So keep in mind that birds can be a good predator for our bad insects or unhelpful insects, as well as other insects. Food is essential, but we want to consider providing water to our pollinator friends as well. Here's a few examples of ways to make water available. If you look on the left, you'll notice there are rocks well, actually in all cases, there are rocks of various sizes that can make it possible for pollinators to access water without the risk of drowning. Patches of bare, damp ground in your garden can also provide needed water. But if you don't have an area like that, you can help the pollinators by setting up watering stations such as these. We want to encourage our pollinators to call our gardens home in future seasons as well. And one of the best ways to do that is to provide the habitat they need to lay eggs and supply food for their emerging young. Here's some examples, including holes in dead trees, patches of bare ground, and dead plant stems for insects to deposit eggs into. There are many forms of pollinator habitat that have become commercially available in recent years, and some of them are helpful, but they can cause problems as well. Bee houses like these can harbor pests and diseases when they are used for multiple seasons. So it's important to clean them out or use tube inserts. You can see some of the examples of the tubes that are available, and there are also paper inserts that are sold that you can remove at the end of the season and discard them. And with it, any pests or diseases that might have come along. It's really debatable how effective these houses actually are, but you might want to consider them. Think about the particular pollinators that you're trying to encourage before you spend a lot of money on these products. So what do we do about the bad bugs that eat our plants and produce in the garden? It's easy to reach for a spray or powder to kill them off, and I'm going to encourage you to take a step back from that approach, even if the insecticide is approved for organic use. These chemicals are mostly broad spectrum killers, which means that they eliminate a wide variety of beneficial bugs along with the culprit that you're trying to get rid of. The broad spectrum insecticides can make things even worse because what we'll end up doing is killing the pest's natural predators along with the culprits. When the pests return, there are no predators to keep them in check, and we end up using more and more chemicals instead. That's what this page is about. Here are some examples of predator insects that can help us keep pests in check if we let them. If you've up in the left corner there, if you've seen a tomato hornworm in all its creepy glory, then you know exactly what it can do to your tomato plants. Of course, you can pick them off, but if you see a hornworm that looks like any brackenid wasp laid its eggs in the hornworm, and what you're seeing here are the eggs that are about to hatch and kill the hornworm by eating it from the inside out. A little gruesome, but it's one of the best ways to get rid of these tomato hornworms, and also to provide your garden with a lot more wasps that can go after future hornworms. The other insects often eat pests or lay eggs in them, and I've shown several examples of each kind of predator. And the insects often do that even when we don't see them, because some of them are tiny and some of them are busy doing their work under leaves, or at times when we don't see them, but they're actually in our gardens if we make the gardens accessible to them. Birds actually can help us as well, and they eat caterpillars or feed them to their young chicks, so we want to encourage them too. Now, I know some of us, I hope you can hear me okay. I've got a slightly unstable connection, but some of us have already got flower gardens when we decide to make space for our vegetable gardens. And I'm going to suggest that there's no need to remove all the existing plants because we now want to include natives. The plants shown here and on the next few slides can provide nectar and pollen for our foragers as well. As gardeners, we get pretty good at finding room for new plants, don't we? I'm always looking for space to tuck something else in there, and that's what we're talking about here. These spring bulbs can be overplanted or interplanted with the natives that we now want to add to our garden beds. They make good choices, providing, here's our spring border. Some examples of summer perennials, including cultivars of native plants. And I want to just say a few words about cultivars. The cultivar means a cultivated variety of an herbaceous plant and or others as well, woody plants. They don't function as host plants for insects though, particularly for those that are looking for the original native species. And they can even confuse some insects to lay their eggs on the cultivar instead of the native plant. What happens then is that when the eggs hatch, the larvae will try to eat the cultivar, and many of them will die because it doesn't provide the right nutrients. So if you want to provide a host plant for a particular insect, I'm suggesting that you stick with the native species instead of a cultivated variety of that plant. Here are some summer annuals, which are longer bloom times than most perennials. Remember, we're trying to keep our garden going into the fall, exactly that. I mentioned the birds several times now, and here are some of the fruits and nuts that they love to find in our gardens. We all know these are people foods too, and you may or may not want to share. So I'm suggesting that you keep a close watch on ripening times if you want to harvest the fruit or the nuts for yourself, because the birds can clean you out overnight. They're experts at it. For example, I have a large old wild blueberry bush, and I mean large by saying that I'm actually quite tall, and this bush is quite a bit taller than me. What I do is I cover several branches, maybe even 4 or 5 of the branches of my wild blueberry with season extension fabric. And I use that instead of bird netting, because then the branches and the fruit does not get caught in the netting. When I do that, I leave the rest of the parts that are just too tall for me to harvest. And the blue jays and the robins will be hovering for days, and they grab everything that I can't actually cover.
Ruth, we have a couple more minutes.
That's all I got. Herbs have many purposes in our edible gardens, and we're usually advised to harvest the leaves before the plants flower to get the most benefit for eating. If possible, it's a good idea to plant some extras and let them go to flower, because they will draw pollinators like crazy when they do. Whenever possible, I like to include flowers inside the vegetable garden as well as around the outsides. Often annuals are the better choice here, because we'll be rotating the positions of our crops for the next year, and perennials can make that a lot more complicated. Here's a section of my garden from last summer that includes lavender. It is perennial, but it also contains zinnias and jewelweed just beyond the fence. The bees loved the jewelweed. I never heard so many bees in one place as when the jewelweed was in flower, and it was in flower for weeks on end, almost until frost. There were also enough squash bees to pollinate this little tiny squash that I planted called honey nut. It's a fantastic squash, and it can be grown on a vertical manner on bamboo in this case, and they were great little fruits. All of these flowers are good examples of plants doing double duty. They both deter pest insects as well as provide resources for foraging bees. The calendulas can deter aphids around brassicas. The marigolds can kill soil nematodes, and the borage repels tomato hornworms as well as attracting bees like mad. And the nasturtiums in the bottom right, if you can see them, are acting as a trap crop, by which I mean that they attract aphids, and then the whole nasturtium plant can be removed and all the aphids that are all over them, and you can get them right out of the garden. So that's a good use for a trap crop. We've talked about many different plants here, as well as a wide variety of pollinators and predators in a short period. The most important thing I hope you'll keep in mind is a set of general principles. We can't control all the plant insect interactions in our gardens, but we can create healthy ecosystems that encourage insects to help us grow healthier food. The more varieties of plants we include, and the better the more varieties of plants we include, the better our chances. We can do this if we skip the pesticides and instead provide water, shelter, and flowers throughout the growing season. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christie. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you so much, Ruth. All of these presentations were excellent. We have a great amount of questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I am going to do my best here. And of course, we do have a couple of events I'll mention now coming up. You know, Christie's hosting another event, or we're hosting Christie for another event. Ruth has another event. So if you love what you see here, you'll definitely want to come back for the rest of the series. So just to start off, I'll start in with some of the beginning questions about testing and choosing sites. So Dana asked, would you recommend soil testing for someone who is more in the woods but still populated, and would they need to check for any other chemicals? Yeah, that's a question for Allison.
I think if you're the places that I've seen the most potential for contaminants are oftentimes very urban areas oftentimes, but if you do think that there might be, if you see things like trash or like for example old burn piles or old dumps oftentimes have a lot of issues, and then if you know that they're like for example old apple trees in an area, then those are some signals that you might just want to check the soil. So if you're in an urban area or sorry, a more rural area, oftentimes I haven't seen problems. But if you are along a high traffic highway, even in the woods, then you might consider testing if you're nearby. But I haven't usually seen problems. But those are some of the areas I would check, the reasons to check.
And additionally, do you have any concerns about BPA when growing in plastic containers?
So that is definitely something to consider. So oftentimes, I think there are, and I'm forgetting the plastic numbers, but you can choose food grade plastics. And I want to say it's like 3, 2, I don't remember the numbers, but I know 5 is one. So, but certain numbers of plastics, if you look it up, you can pick ones that are not problematic for that. Also, if you have incredibly active soil biology, a lot of your soil biology can do a lot of buffering for you. But again, containers are harder to maintain those, that active soil biology. So I'll say those pieces.
Mhm. And Peggy asked, does anyone offer PFAS soil testing? That's polyfluoroalkyl substances.
I don't know the answer to the question, actually. Yeah. I know that, so I will, lead is oftentimes the one that is most, the one you can get most easily, but lead is also an indicator oftentimes for other issues. There are a lot of other things you can't test for, but if you have a handful of the other heavy metals, then you might have problems in other areas as well. So it can correlate.
And in addition to choosing the right site, we were interested about some of the basically growing in this climate with lots of trees and shade, what's possible in a shady site?
And I guess I can start that question, although I'm sure some other folks can answer too, but I would say that there is a lot possible. So especially greens, if you do really focus in on growing things. So as Christy had mentioned, those cut and come again crops, some things like if you're really interested in growing greens, kale and chard are these all season excellent crops that can produce their biennials, meaning they'll produce for the whole season. Parsley, there's a handful of them that do really well. And if you do have crops that bolt, it's sometimes hard to take them out. Bolting means flowering, but when it gets warmer, but if you are just really systematic about it, as soon as they stop producing at their first flush, you just pull them out and put in the new crop or have successions of them, you can actually produce quite a bit. But you have to kind of don't feel bad about it. Definitely do that actively. Or use them for mulch. And kind of cut them down and then plant in between if you're doing a low impact growing.
Well, as you mentioned the cut and come again, Lynn asked, if you harvest the cut and come again style, does that impact the growth of the rest of the plant?
Yeah, so oftentimes the cut and come again crops, at least from my experience, sometimes like, for example, lettuce or even chard or kale or spinach, harvesting those outer leaves and continue to harvest those big outer leaves and leave those center ones to keep growing is oftentimes a great way to do it. For some herbs, some do respond, like basil does respond actually really well for just chopping off the top. And then it kind of encourages multiple new tops to form and it creates a bushier, more active plant, same with mint and some of the other ones. So just again, get to know your plants, but how you harvest can really boost your yields.
I've also found that plants like celery can be treated as cut and come again plants. You can harvest, you can cut the whole thing down a few inches from the garden soil, and you'll get nice new growth right from the center in just a few weeks.
Excellent. I think there's a few specific questions about some particular crops. For example, is a Three Sisters garden, corn, beans, and squash of good use? And what crops should we grow near or around each other for maximum use of space?
I can answer that if you want me to. The Three Sisters is a traditional collection of crops grown together. We as colonial settlers were taught this by the Native Americans who were here. The corn is grown in the middle. Generally, you want to get the corn started a few weeks before you do anything else, so that as it grows, it can act as support for your beans as they start to grow, and they will wind themselves around the corn stalks. And then the squash goes around the outside of both of those plants to take advantage of the nitrogen that the beans are fixing in the soil, and also to shade the soil and keep it moister than it would be otherwise. So it's a great combination.
There are a couple more specific questions. For example, there's someone who has been planting garlics. Mary Beth has been planting carrots and has been unsuccessful with great tops, but really tiny roots. What do you think might be a problem there with that?
And so carrots again with very tiny roots.
Yeah, great growth up top, not so much down below.
Well, one option. There's a couple different things it could be. One is crowding. So, you know, again, that square foot gardening method is a great option, you know, for if you're growing in a smaller space, but making sure that there's enough thinning. I actually have a picture of carrots that were seeded at the same time, clustered together without kind of, you know, thinning out, and then some that are just grown more spaced out. And the amount of growth, there sometimes they have little tiny carrots, and then the other one was the single carrot weighed more than the 3 tiny carrots that were crushed kind of together. So plants really do respond to being too crowded. So thinning can be really, really helpful for that. Also, from a soil perspective, boron is oftentimes lacking in soils, and it's a micronutrient needed in tiny amounts. Borax is the laundry soap flakes thing is a really great way to do it, but it's very, very small amount, like less, you know, like a little bit of a teaspoon of those flakes mixed in with water and compost tea is watered over plants can be a great way. And if you get a response, beets, a lot of root vegetables, if they don't get that, they don't bulk up.
Yeah, I would second that. Almost always, if carrots are producing really skinny little roots, it's thinning. And I think it's one of the hardest things for gardeners to do with below ground crops. When we have an above ground crop, it's really obvious to us when crops are crowded. We can see that above ground. But when the part you want to harvest is growing below the ground, it's not so easy. So I usually tell people and the other thing is carrot seed is really small. And so when you sow your seed, it can be very easy to dump a whole lot of seed into a drill and then have a gazillion carrots coming up. And the thinning is a real headache. So I always tell people when you're sowing, take a seed packet, a paper seed packet, fold a crease in it, and then tap your seeds so that they line up in the crease, and take the time to drop them out one at a time into the drill. It takes time, but it's much easier to take the time to do that in the beginning than to try and thin later. And thinning can stress the crops that are left behind. So if you have a whole lot of carrots all piled close together and you have to thin them out, you're going to damage the ones you leave behind. So number one, sow thinly. Number two, thin early while the plants are really tiny. If you thin to the right distance when they're tiny, it can look like you don't have very many plants. But what you want to do is imagine the width of your ideal carrot and understand that your carrot seedlings cannot be any closer together than that width, because you have to have enough room for 2 halves of carrots between those leaves. So when you're thinking about each crop, a beet would need more space. If you want a nice mature beet to be a couple of inches to 3 inches in diameter, your plants have to be that far apart or they can't do it. So imagine the final crop and then thin to that distance.
It can also be the case that carrots have trouble pushing that root through compacted soil. So you want to plant your carrots into the loosest soil that you have, and if it's not loose when you start, you want to get your fork out and loosen that soil before you plant the carrot seeds.
And we have a few minutes left. I think I'd like to wrap up with 1 or 2 more questions. And this one in particular about how to build up our soil with minerals and such before we plant. How much time should we wait after preparing our soil, and what are your recommended soil preparations for a first-time garden?
That's where your soil test comes in handy, and it's really hard to give a very simple answer. I'm not as much a soil expert as I'm sure Allison is. I speak from my own personal experience rather than a heavy-duty science, but it can depend also on what you need to add to the soil, because some of your soil amendments need to be added as much as 6 months or almost a year ahead of time for them to actually have an impact on the soil. Others will have some impact almost immediately. So I would say start with a soil test. It's a great idea. It's like a baseline medical test when you go for your physical. and it will tell you what you have and what you need. And a good soil test laboratory should also give you advice about when and how much of soil amendments need to be added. I put in a pitch for NOFA because the soil test that NOFA does is very comprehensive, and the advice that you get back is very specific.
For gardeners, small scale, one really easy way to do it, I oftentimes compost is as good as only as good as the ingredients that go into it. It has the biology there too, but in terms of minerally, it can be, you know, the more diverse ingredients that you can get in there, the more diversity you can, you know, bring in nutrition wise. Also different food sources for things. So I usually like to add compost, and then a good all-purpose fertilizer blend, organic version that has a good micronutrient base. So a lot of versions like ProGrow or you know, there's a bunch of different options, but a good all-purpose organic fertilizer that has a micronutrient base. Organic fertilizers are much better for the soil, building up the soil. And so that's something that you can add before planting, and you can plant directly right before planting. If you're adding amendments or doing something correcting deficiencies, then oftentimes adding those in the fall, unless they're very soluble, you might want to wait. If you're doing it right before planting, maybe 2 weeks if you're adding bigger amendments, like things that really adjust the soil. But you can, a lot of times you can add those in the fall. Or over the winter sometime, or right before planting. But if you want to give, like boron, for example, is one of those ones that can inhibit seed germination. If it's added right then, if it happens to be right by the seed, and so giving it like a week or two, or mixing it in with a carbon buffer like compost or compost tea, if you add it dissolved in water, that can really help.
Mulching is also a really good idea, because you don't want that compost to sit on top of your garden and dry out, because the active biology in the soil will dry out with it, and it won't be able to process those minerals and make them bioavailable to your plants. So once you've added the compost or the minerals or other amendments that you plan to add to the garden, get some mulch on that garden to protect both the soil and the amendments that you've just put down.
We are super grateful. Thank you so much, Ruth and Christie and Allison, for all that great insight and information. As I mentioned, if you've loved what you've seen here, you know, we encourage you to become a NOFA Mass member and or make a donation to help keep this work going. We have a whole series of events coming up. This event was designed to intrigue you, inspire you. So, you know, the next events go into topics in a little bit greater detail. So if you didn't get your question answered, be sure to come back and keep those in mind. Again, we have our next webinar is actually coming up. For those of you who are interested in our inspiring ideas from experts in the fields, the next webinar is coming up on Monday, and it's about using traditional and non-traditional ways of gaining farmland. Our presenters are Gabriela Pereira, Jamie Pottern, and Shemariah Bloom-Evitz. Next Tuesday, the next part of this series, we'll be talking to ML Altobelli to learn about building raised beds that really thrive and will continue to thrive. And we are gearing up for our 2021 hybrid summer conference this year in August. So stay tuned for more information coming up. I want to say thanks again to our sponsors, Ward's Nursery, and Chelsea Green as well has supported us. Be sure to say thanks to Chelsea Green and Ward's Nursery if you go and shop there. So from everyone at NOFA Mass, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.